Hey guys, tonight we're going to break into the bedroom of King Henry VIII. You might think you know everything about the king with so many wives and those chopped off heads, but the truth is far more horrifying than that. This room was not just a place for rest. It was a torture chamber in disguise where every breath and every gesture was monitored. Happiness here was just an illusion, and a wedding night could easily become the final night. Everything you imagine as romantic was inspected, recorded, and judged by an army of spies and servants. If you think 50 Shades of Grey is the pinnacle of boldness, then buckle up, because we're about to explore the 8 horrifying rules of Henry VIII's bedroom. Each rule is a door opening to a brutal and tragic aspect of royal marriage under the Tudor dynasty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And now, dear friends, let us step together into the dark journey of Emperor Henry VIII's bedchamber. In the following section, we will sequentially explore 8 horrifying rules, each rule opening a door to a brutal and tragic aspect of royal marriage life under the Tudor reign. From the merciless wedding night inspections, to the pressure to conceive as a matter of life and death, from the terror of constant surveillance to the spectre of vicious rumors, every detail will reveal how supreme power turned marriage into an inescapable nightmare. Join me as we continue, and prepare for the most terrifying truths that history has never revealed. You may think you understand the story of Henry VIII, the king famous for 6 controversial marriages and the clatter of 100 guillotines, but allow your mind to drift into the dim candlelight of his bedchamber, and you will discover a secret far more horrifying than any history lesson dares to tell. Imagine stepping across the threshold of your wedding night, only to find yourself in a royal torture chamber, your most intimate moments stripped of all privacy, reduced to evidence in a court of power. As dusk falls over the palace, the Queen does not retreat into peaceful seclusion. Instead, she enters a world where every breath, every whisper, every shiver is subject to relentless scrutiny. Outside the heavy oak door, the king's attendants, ladies-in-waiting, guards, and the royal physician assemble like predatory birds, straining to hear the faintest sound. They do not stand guard to protect. They stand guard to monitor, to document, to judge. In their ears, the queen's softest moans echo as proof of a consummation that the realm demands. But listening alone is not enough. The court even installs small observation slits in the chamber walls, through which invisible eyes watch the queen's every movement. In those tiny apertures, spies peer, recording gestures, noting hesitations, evaluating compliance. The bedchamber transforms into a stage. The queen, once a princess of gentle birth, becomes an actress forced to perform for an audience of power. Each tense heartbeat, each subtle shift, becomes part of her trial. The humiliation is profound. Imagine that even an accidental bodily sound, a cough or a slip of air, might be written down in the secret court ledger as evidence of guilt. When morning light finally seeps through the stained glass windows, the chamber's true horror is revealed. The royal physician, flanked by stern-faced courtiers, enters without invitation. He inspects the sheets, turning down the fine linens with mathematical precision, searching for a single drop of blood or the faintest bruise. A missing stain, a smear too faint, spells disaster. With ink-stained fingers, he annotates a dossier that will decide if the marriage has been proved, or if the queen stands accused of treason, witchcraft, or deceiving the king. One lonely drop of blood, or its absence, can condemn her to exile, or even the executioner's axe. Catherine of Aragon, the first to face this dreadful ritual, found herself gripped by terror at the very sight of the bedchamber door. Court records speak of her fainting spells as she approached the threshold, her heart pounding with dread at the thought of unseen ears and eyes waiting to judge her. In the dim corridors of the palace, she became known for her shaking hands and hollow gaze, the product of countless sleepless nights, haunted by the knowledge that her body was not her own. Modern psychologists would identify her condition as severe anxiety, a trauma born not of battle poverty, but of an unrelenting invasion of her most private self. Yet no petition could spare Catherine this ordeal. Royal protocol demanded obedience. On her wedding night, she was compelled to surrender herself fully, without hesitation, without complaint. Even the holy sacrament of marriage offered no refuge. It was twisted into a rite of surveillance, a grotesque mockery of sacred trust. All the while, Henry himself retired to his bed with the assured arrogance of divine right, confident that his subjects would never question his methods, for to challenge the king's authority was to risk everything. And so the queen endured, night after night, until her strength was spent and her spirit nearly broken. The palace walls, decorated with tapestries of piety and power, seemed to close in around her, whispering of loyalty and lineage, reminding her that her worth was measured only by her success in this grim performance. The flicker of torchlight on the worn oak floorboards cast long shadows that danced like spectres, echoing the silent cries of every woman who had come before. This, then, is the chilling reality of Henry VIII's bedchamber. Not a haven of love and warmth, but a stage for political theatre, where the Queen's body became a battleground, her consent a matter of state, and her privacy a casualty of royal ambition. Drift now into a restless slumber, if you can, for the echoes of those hidden witnesses will linger long after you close your eyes. Rule 1. The wedding night must be proven. At the very moment the wedding chamber door opens, it is not a romantic private scene as in fairy tales, but the commencement of an official royal trial. Every first night after marrying Henry VIII is not simply a milestone of happiness, but has been transformed into the most rigorous inspection in the Tudor court. In that half-dream, half-wake space of the evening, when the dying candle leaves fragrant drips of wax upon the shelf, the bride's heart holds no room for love. It only trembles with worry over whether she will survive this fateful examination. As soon as the first shaft of dawn light filters through the small window, the royal physician, draped in a white robe speckled with dark ink marks from his waiting list, enters with a solemn procession of courtiers. They carry no blessings, only medical instruments, and a yellowed leather ledger, ready to record every detail. Their footsteps are soft, yet each step sends a ripple of tension through the chamber. The bride knows that she and the king will be judged at this very moment. They inspect the bed linens meticulously, searching for blood, a sign of the first consummation, as though examining a crime scene. Every tiny red stain upon the pristine white sheets is illuminated by the physician's lantern, flagged and documented with painstaking care. The investigation extends beyond the sheets to include the Queen's undergarments and personal effects. Diaphanous silk, blood, soaked linen, and even her embroidered handkerchief are measured and compared against standard samples stored in the royal archives. Should they discover any discrepancy or omission, say, not a single drop of blood, or a stain so faint as to be indiscernible, the report is immediately inscribed with the charge of deceiving the king. The Queen then faces harsh sentences, annulment, exile, or even execution. In the case of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, her marriage was nearly annulled simply because the court failed to find sufficient wedding night evidence. She lived in constant dread, each night a battle to fulfill her duty while her nerves were taut as violin strings. On more than one occasion, Catherine fainted at the threshold of the bedchamber, her heart pounding with terror at the thought of hundreds of unseen eyes straining to catch a single sound or the absence thereof. From the perspective of modern psychologists, this experience inflicts severe consequences: post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic anxiety. They argue that transforming the marital bed into a psychological crime scene where the fear of inspection merges with the dread of condemnation creates a state of perpetual tension. Each time the Queen enters the chamber, she carries the fear: will there be enough blood on the sheets? Will the stains be clear? Will I face punishment? Her mind finds no moment of peace amidst the cold grandeur of the court, where every breath can become evidence. Moreover, this system completely strips her of bodily autonomy and privacy. The Queen is not permitted to refuse the inspection. She has no right to conceal or to complain. Compliance is mandatory, and any expression of pain, shame, or hesitation may be recorded as evidence of reluctance, leading to accusations of adultery or witchcraft. This unrelenting pressure crushes not only her body but also her spirit, leaving a queen like Catherine unable to sleep, unable to look toward tomorrow, with hope only anticipating the next trial. Amid the bleak tableau of the Tudor bedchamber, the true meaning of royal marriage is cruelly distorted. It is not a union of souls, but a demonstration of absolute power. The wedding night must be proven. Inspection becomes the supreme ritual, where a single drop of blood can determine the fate of an entire dynasty. And when the morning's examination concludes, the courtiers depart in silence, leaving behind an exhausted queen who bears within her heart invisible wounds that may never heal. Rule 2. Absolutely no refusal allowed. Upon entering the bedchamber of Henry VIII, the Queen forfeits all sovereignty over her own body. Rule 2 is so draconian that any sign of reluctance is deemed the seed of treason. Whether from exhaustion, illness, or an inability to endure the stench of decay, the Queen must never refuse the King's summons to his bed. It is said that, in his later years, Henry VIII bore grievous ailments. His weight surpassed 400 pounds. His leg ulcers oozed pus until his flesh grew soft and rank with the odour of rot. In the stifling confines of the royal chamber, the stench of gangrene lingered in the air, causing all who entered to hold their breath. Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife, recorded in her diary that she had to press a scented cloth tightly against her nose, battling waves of nausea each time the king made his advances. Yet even this feeble barrier offered no escape from the cruel mandate. The Queen must obey, despite every moment being a nightmare of body and soul. A clandestine network of court spies, composed of loyal ladies-in-waiting and covert guards, vigilantly logged the Queen's reactions. Any momentary hesitation, any fleeting pause, or any expression of insufficient ardour was recorded in a secret dossier. Those ink-stained pages then served as evidence of the Queen's alleged disloyalty. Even a soft sigh or a muted word uttered behind the closed door could kindle suspicion. In a system of absolute power, none dared champion the Queen. She could only endure, her physical agony transmuted into a sacred duty. By the dim glow of candlelight, the bedchamber unfolded like the stage of a tragic drama where fear reached its zenith. As the Queen crossed the threshold, she suppressed every yearning for comfort or affection to fulfill her assigned obligation. Each time the King extended his hand, she would close her eyes tightly, retreating inward to preserve whatever composure she could muster amid the horror. The odour of disease, the sticky sensation of pus on her skin, the faint sound of linens being drawn, all merged into a relentless nightmare that spanned the entire night. Modern psychologists recognize this behavior as tantamount to domestic violence and marital sexual coercion. The woman has no right to refuse, no right to breathe freely, only to endure like a weary warrior on a battlefield. Yet in the Tudor court, this was considered normal, an indispensable facet of Henry VIII's regime, in which he assumed the divine prerogative to control his wife's body and sexuality, treating the Queen as little more than a possession. Catherine of Aragon, Catherine Howard, and the other queens all once endured this merciless rule. Catherine Howard, with her youthful spirit and heart yearning for love, embraced dreams of happiness only to find herself trapped in an inescapable nightmare. She recounted that on her first night, when the king summoned her, she glimpsed his silhouette flickering in the pale candlelight. A whiff of foul odour assaulted her senses, provoking revulsion so profound that she had to muster every ounce of courage. Yet the instant she hesitated merely a single second of delay, a rustle of parchment from outside the door signalled that an invisible eye was watching. She knew refusal was impossible. Resistance was out of the question. Beneath the heavy covers, the Queen lay motionless, listening to the king's laboured breathing, trying to convince herself that it was merely a dream, after which peace would return upon awakening. But each time she opened her eyes, she saw only the chamber walls, the dim glow of the candle, and she imagined the unseen ears that strained to listen. In her heart she prayed for the night to end swiftly, for morning's light to bring hope. But such hope was elusive, for at dawn's first light she would be dragged back into the next round of interrogation. Amid this horror, physical and psychological violence intertwined, forming an indelible scar upon the Queen's psyche. She could neither cry for help, nor seek refuge in the sanctity of marriage. She could do nothing but obey the orders of a king who claimed divine authority to govern another's body. Rule 2 laid bare the ruthlessness of the Tudor monarchy. Marriage was not an alliance of love, but an inescapable sentence. No rewind, no refusal, only silent endurance. Rule 3. Bodies as evidence. In the dim glow of candlelight, the royal bedchamber becomes a silent courtroom where flesh and bone serve as the sovereign's testimony. Rule 3, the most insidious of all, dictates that every physiological function of marriage must be harnessed as a political instrument against the Queen. Henry VIII, who proclaimed himself God's chosen on earth, refused to allow any blemish upon his divine image. Thus, whenever conjugal duties faltered, the blame was meticulously shifted onto his wife's body rather than his own. Consider the case of Anne of Cleves, his fourth queen. When Henry found no spark of passion, nor the promise of heirs in their union, he publicly denounced her as unclean, a woman so repellent that she had inadvertently cursed his manhood. In hushed whispers throughout the palace, courtiers spoke of Anne's alleged foulness, of the devilish potency attributed to her virtue or lack thereof. The scandal spread like mist through the corridors, leaving Anne to face not only the king's displeasure, but the entire machinery of court intrigue. Similarly, when his marriage to Catherine Howard grew cold, Henry accused her of witchcraft, proclaiming that she had conjured spells to thwart his desires. The notion that a woman's allure or absence of it could wield such supernatural force became a convenient pretext for political ruin. Each accusation served as a cudgel, a means to justify annulments, exile, or worse. The Queen's body, once a symbol of sacred union, was reduced to a stage upon which allegations of sorcery or shame were performed. Under Rule 3, the royal physician and a retinue of attendants waited outside the bedchamber door, ready to pounce the instant the tryst concluded. These were not tender healers, but stern examiners armed with lancets, inspection mirrors, and ledger books. Their task was to record every detail of the intimate encounter, the presence or absence of consummation, the king's performance, and, most importantly, the Queen's potential for fertility. They inspected the king's body for signs of virility, and the Queen's for evidence of conception symptoms that science of the era could hardly interpret, but which held the power to alter destinies. This grim process was known in court circles as the performance review. Far from a medical consultation, it was a spectacle of political enforcement. If the Queen failed to produce a male heir within the first months of marriage, she risked being branded incompetent or cursed. Medieval physicians, guided by a blend of superstition and rudimentary science, examined the Queen's pulse, her urine, and even her menstrual blood, searching for any indication that she had sabotaged the king's lineage. Such examinations might involve the application of pungent poultices, the tasting of bodily fluids, or the insertion of crude instruments, each procedure accompanied by murmured gossip and envy, as well as the ever-present fear of discovery. Modern medical analysis suggests that Henry VIII likely suffered from severe erectile dysfunction due to his morbid obesity, possible diabetes, and chronic leg ulcers. Yet to admit such frailty would have shattered the myth of his divine right. Instead, the court's entire apparatus turned upon the Queen. Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and even Catherine of Aragon bore the full weight of scrutiny. Each deficit in reproduction was cited as proof of their shortcomings, as though the biology of childbirth rested solely on their shoulders. The psychological toll was immense. Queens endured repeated traumas, their bodies subjected to invasive tests that left both physical and emotional scars. Many suffered from what modern psychologists would identify as post-traumatic stress disorder and severe anxiety. Each night, as dawn approached, they faced the dread of another examination, another chance for court scribes to note their failure and feed it to the ravenous rumour mill. The personal horror of this exploitation stands in stark contrast to the outward splendour of the Tudor court. Amid the flicker of torches and the velvet tapestries, the Queen's body was no longer her own. She became an object of political calculation, measured, weighed, and judged by standards she could never satisfy. The physician's quill was more fearsome than a sword, for it penned the record that could condemn her to disgrace or worse. Should the entries in his journal declare her fruitless or suspicious, the Queen faced annulment, banishment, or accusations of witchcraft. The stakes were far higher than any battlefield, for here the adversary lay within the most intimate realm of marriage. Despite the brutality of these rites, they were accepted as ordinary by Tudor standards. In a culture where the king's will was law, the Queen's autonomy evaporated under the weight of tradition and tyranny. She could not refuse the examinations, nor could she protest the indignities. To object would only confirm her supposed guilt. Thus, day after day, night after night, The cycle repeated itself. The Queen's flesh and fluid became incontrovertible evidence in the political theatre of the bedchamber. Imagine, if you will, a queen lying prostrate on a canopy bed, her body trembling from fear and shame, as physicians lifted curtains and lifted hems. The hush of the chamber was broken only by the soft rustle of robes and the scratch of quills. Somewhere beyond the tapestries, courtiers exchanged glances, ready to pounce on any sign of guilt. The Queen, her spirit battered by betrayal and humiliation, could only pray for mercy from a monarch who saw her suffering as necessary sacrifice. And yet, even as their bodies were disassembled and scrutinized, some queens found the strength to endure, to navigate the brutal protocols with grace and courage. Their resilience, a quiet rebellion against the most invasive rule of Tudor rule, reminds us that human dignity can survive even the most demeaning ordeals. But the cost was often devastating. Stolen years of privacy, fractured trust, and the eternally haunting knowledge that the body meant to unite two souls had become the ultimate instrument of political will. Rule 4. Guards at the door. As you drift deeper into the candlelit haze of Tudor slumber, imagine the gentle click of a heavy oak door, a sound meant to seal away the world beyond. Yet under Rule 4, that door no longer offers sanctuary. Instead, it stands sentinel to relentless scrutiny. No longer do royal guards stand to protect. They stand to eavesdrop, timing every moan, recording every sigh, and reporting it all to the king's judges at dawn. Privacy, that tender gift of intimacy, is utterly revoked. Outside the bedchamber of Henry VIII, the corridor stretches long and shadowed, its tapestries muffling noise, yet doing nothing to deter the watchful eyes and ears posted at regular intervals. A pair of guards, clad in sombre tabards emblazoned with the Tudor rose, lean against the stone walls. Their duty is not the defence of queen or country, but the surveillance of one queen alone. They clutch their wooden staffs as if they were stethoscopes, ears keen for the faintest whisper of rapture or reluctance. A hush descends whenever the Queen's chamber door opens or closes, for every breath within is a potential piece of evidence. These sentries measure the length of each nocturnal encounter with solemn precision, using brass tally marks scratched into the wood beside them. A moan extended beyond a certain threshold may be noted as evidence of willing participation, whereas a single gasp might be flagged as hesitation requiring inquiry. By break of day, the guards deliver detailed accounts, times stamped in hushed tones, descriptions of sounds too delicate for any chronicler outside these walls. Even the decorous shuffle of a slippered foot across the rug can be interpreted as resistance or submission, each open to the court's merciless reading. But listening alone would not suffice. The Tudor court, in its unquenchable thirst for control, even carved small observation slits into the chamber walls, secret peepholes that allowed invisible eyes to watch the Queen's every gesture. These apertures, no larger than a man's thumbprint, gave spies often disguised as ladies in waiting or silent sentinels a direct view of the royal bed. Through these holes, they witnessed the rise and fall of silk and linen, recorded the Queen's hesitation, her posture, the slightest recoil or yielding. Every movement was logged in a ledger, more fearsome than any torture device. Inside, the Queen felt the weight of these unseen witnesses. Anne Boleyn, forced into compliance by duty and fear, later described the sensation as though her body were on a stage, her performance graded by unseen critics. Even Catherine Howard, with youthful hopes of marital bliss, could not escape the notion that her slightest tremor or momentary flinch was observed, analysed, and preserved in the grim archives of royal surveillance. They spoke in whispers of the watchers on the wall, a phantom court assembled solely to monitor the intimate union that, by right of divine ordinance, should have been sacred and private. Anticipating the moment when the royal physician would emerge, the Queen pressed her lips close to the cold surface of the oak door, heart pounding with dread. She knew that once the king's needs were deemed fulfilled, the physician draped in a sombre black gown would be summoned. His presence dispelled any remaining illusions of privacy. Instruments of examination already poised, ready to catalogue the physical evidence of the previous night's performance. The chamber, once a sanctuary of whispered endearments and shared warmth, became a laboratory of coercion, a place where two bodies were dissected in public view without ever removing their silken coverings. Under the dim glow of a tallow candle, the atmosphere grew taut. The Queen's mind fluttered between fear and a numbing resignation. Her pulse raced not from passion, but from the knowledge that every exhale, every sigh, every involuntary murmur would be scrutinized. It was as if the walls themselves breathed with anticipation, alive with the echoes of prior examinations. The scent of lavender, once meant to calm, mingled with the musty odor of stone and secrecy. Even the softest whisper seemed to echo in the darkness, replayed by the vigilant ears beyond the door. Modern psychologists might liken this to a perpetual state of hypervigilance, an anxiety disorder born of relentless surveillance. The Queen could never relax into the embrace of sleep, for the watchers outside ensured that her dreams were haunted by the spectre of that door. Each night's ritual served not only to enforce obedience, but to erode her very sense of self. Intimacy, meant to bind two souls, was perverted into a means of subjugation. Yet in the silence, the Queen found fleeting moments of defiance. With eyes closed, she sometimes imagined the guards turned to stone, their ears deaf to her pains and pleasures. She conjured in her mind the warmth of a cottage hearth away from the marble halls, a place where trust might still exist. But dawn's first light always shattered the illusion, and with it, the sound of footsteps, those measured, tireless steps, echoed down the corridor, heralding the physician's arrival. Rule 5. Pregnancy as a matter of life and death. As you drift deeper into this candlelit tale, let your breath slow and your eyelids grow heavy, for Rule 5 demands that the Queen's very body be conscripted into the service of dynastic continuity. Under the strict Tudor succession laws, bearing a son is not merely a personal honour, it is the political bedrock upon which an entire dynasty rests. Any delay in conception is viewed as an act of high treason, a dereliction so severe that the consequences can rival those of conspiring against the crown. From the first blush of marriage, the royal physician begins his relentless vigil. He tracks the Queen's menstrual cycle with the precision of a modern fertility specialist, yet armed only with medieval instruments and superstition. Each morning, he measures her body temperature, examines her urine for strange hues or sediments, and even queries her dreams for portentous visions. The Queen's diet becomes a living experiment in the five elements theory. Certain fruits are prescribed, specific meats mandated, and such a profusion of herbal concoctions is swallowed that the line between nourishment and poison blurs. A brew of pennyroyal or rue, both known abortifacients, may be forced upon her in the name of strengthening the womb, leaving her weak, nauseated, and sometimes perilously close to death. If weeks turn into months without hope of a male heir, the ordeal intensifies. The Queen is subjected to daily pelvic examinations, crude by any modern standard. Courtiers whisper of a search of the bowels, of the physician using a finger dipped in oil to probe the cervix, all recorded in hushed notes on vellum. Should those tests remain inconclusive, the physician turns to foul-smelling poultices pressed against the abdomen, believing that external application might coax fertility from within. Each step of this process is a torture of flesh and will, accompanied by the clack of quills recording her failures in the annals of state medicine. Catherine of Aragon, the first consort, endured 6 or 7 miscarriages, each one a fresh wound to her spirit and to the Tudor cause. Court accounts describe her splintering sobs as she clutched her embroidered handkerchief, shaking with grief and humiliation. The Queen cried bitterly. One courier wrote, fearing her womb's betrayals would cost her everything. For Catherine, the medical interventions only compounded her sorrow, as each miscarriage was met with suspicion. Was it mere misfortune, or evidence of a hidden defect, or even witchcraft? But it is not enough to merely conceive. The Queen's attitude during these rituals is as closely monitored as the physical evidence. Should she display too much zeal, laughing or gasping with perceived pleasure, the court suspects a history of carnal experience beyond the marriage bed. Conversely, if she appears reserved or uneasy, they label her as half-hearted, unwilling to fulfill her duty. In the Tudor obsession with production, even emotional expression becomes suspect. The Queen's very feelings are policed, her humanity replaced by the mechanical logic of the air-producing machine. Modern reproductive specialists would scoff at such methods, pointing out the absence of any scientific basis for these trials. Yet the Tudor court wields power through ritual, and its rituals hold sway over life and death. The Queen's body is not her own. It is an instrument of statecraft, calibrated to the demands of succession. Every drop of blood, every rhythmic twinge, is no teaser-worthy a data point in the chart of dynastic health. The stakes could not be higher. According to the Duke of Norfolk's grim warning, if she does not soon bear a prince, the throne shall stand on shaky ground. For Henry VIII, the realm's survival is bound to a male heir, whose birth would secure the Tudor line against challengers and rebellions. The Queen shoulders the entire burden of posterity. Her flesh and fluids become the repository of dynastic hopes. And yet, there is no solace in the notion of motherhood. The Queen's sense of self disintegrates beneath the crushing weight of expectation. She cannot conceive in private. Her triumphs and failures are public record. No lullaby soothes her as she labours under the scrutiny of courtiers and physicians. Instead of joy at her changing form, she feels panic at each flutter or cramp, fearing it a harbinger of another miscarriage and another climb toward oblivion. The psychological torment is as vivid as any physical affliction. Each passing month brings fresh anxiety. Will the next examination herald good tidings, or will the quill scratch out another line of despair? Court gossip, sharpened like blades, spins out tales of barren wombs and ill-omened portents, further fraying the Queen's nerve. Beneath the gilded canopy, she lies awake at night, heart pounding, dreading the physician's footstep and the heralding knock upon her door. And in this bleak tableau, the Queen cannot escape into the solace of love. Her husband, the King, may offer fleeting words of reassurance, but his own anxieties mirror hers, his affection laced with the tension of a saviour's urgency. Their union, meant once to symbolize devotion, becomes a contract of survival. Her womb must produce, or her head may next adorn a block. As you feel the pull of sleep grow stronger, imagine the Queen's trembling hand resting on a velvet pillow. Her mind drifts through the corridors of memory, recalling tender moments now overshadowed by dread. She prays silently for a swift conclusion to these painful rituals, yet trembles at the thought of the tribunal awaiting her at each dawn. Thus, Rule 5. Pregnancy as a matter of life and death stands as the ultimate testament to the Tudor belief that a queen's worth is measured in sons. Every forced potion, every invasive exam, every recorded heartbeat converges upon a single desperate goal, the birth of a prince. In that hope, and in that terror, the Queen finds herself bound to an ancient covenant, one that demands her body as both sacrificial altar and battlefield. Rule 6. Danger of losing favour and the death sentence. In the gentle hush that settles over the palace at midnight, a queen's heart ought to find solace in the warmth of conjugal trust. Under Rule 6, however, the bedchamber transforms into a chamber of death once favour is lost. Even after bearing children, queens remain perched on a razor's edge. For Henry VIII's affection is as fickle as the shifting tides. One moment he bestows lavish gifts and whispered promises. The next he casts his consort into the abyss of suspicion without warning. Consider the tragic fate of Anne Boleyn, a woman once held aloft on a pedestal of royal adoration. For 3 fleeting years, she captivated the court with her wit and charm, a figure of fascination who redefined Henry's views on love and power. Yet that same bedchamber, where Henry once pressed kisses upon her forehead, became the stage for her downfall. Behind closed doors, Anne's most intimate words and gestures were surreptitiously recorded by spies hidden within the walls and among her own ladies in waiting. These whispers of pillow talk, once meant to bind husband and wife, were twisted into damning evidence of adultery, treason, and witchcraft. Even as the king continued to summon Anne to his bed, his inner circle secretly convened in shadowed corridors, gathered testimonies extracted under duress from terrified maids. They spoke of conversations taken out of context, of forced confessions coaxed by pain and fear. Every sigh she breathed, every subtle hesitation or flinch of surprise was catalogued as proof of her perfidy. Thus, the bedchamber, once a sanctuary of mutual comfort, became a battlefield bedroom where psychological warfare reigned supreme and innocence counted for nothing. Similarly, Catherine Howard, her youthful predecessor, lived hand in hand with a would-be executioner. Even after the court's secret inquiry into her past liaisons had begun, she was compelled to greet Henry's advances with a forced smile. Within the gilded canopy of her marital bed, Catherine fought to suppress terror at every touch, knowing that any sign of reluctance might be construed as treasonous intent. Modern criminologists describe these tactics as systematic psychological abuse, cultivating fear, extracting confessions, and weaponizing intimacy so that the victim becomes complicit in her own condemnation. Under Rule 6, the power to strip a queen of favor carried with it the power to strip her of life. To fall from Henry's good graces was to invite a death sentence as swift as it was irreversible. In the Tudor imagination, marriage was no mere union of hearts but a contract underwritten by divine right, and any breach, real or perceived, warrants the ultimate penalty. The blade of the executioner, perched on the scaffold, was but a mirror of the betrayal enacted in the quiet of the bedchamber, where the king's suspicions found form in whispers behind locked doors. Once favour was lost, the state's machinery of accusation moved with chilling efficiency. Courtiers with eager pens drafted charges of unfaithfulness. Clergy, eager to curry royal favour, affirmed that forsaking the king's bed was tantamount to spiritual as well as civil treason. The queen, whose voice once commanded respect and whose presence once inspired devotion, found herself stripped of every title but one: defendant. Even the simplest act of resting too long in bed, of delaying the summons, could be construed as contumacy, a willful defiance of royal command. Yet the most harrowing aspect of Rule 6 lies in its betrayal of trust. Where love and loyalty should have reigned, Henry fostered an environment of paranoia and dread. He cultivated spies at court, encouraging them to report not only overt acts of disloyalty, but the subtlest shift in demeanour. The Queen's own chambermaids, sworn to her service, would be compelled to deliver if they indicated any sign of discomfort or fear. When those silent observers recorded her gasp of pain or her quickened breath as evidence of duplicity, Catherine and Anne alike recognized that the intimacy meant to unite them had become a noose of political expediency. As dawn's first light crept through narrow windows, a hush would fall over the bedchamber. The Queen, her head heavy with grief and exhaustion, would brace herself for the summons of the Royal Council. There, before stone-faced judges, the murmured testimonies of her most private moments would be laid bare. Accusations of adultery, of betrayal, even of witchcraft rose not from truth, but from the twisted interpretation of whispered words. The Queen, once consort, once companion, was reduced to a suspect, judged on the testimony of intimacy itself. The inevitability of the scaffold loomed, a silver blade mounted upon a wooden block, waiting for the moment when the Queen's fate would be sealed. Anne Boleyn's final walk through the palace corridors was as lonely as any common criminal's, her hands bound, her crown replaced by a hood. Catherine Howard's end was similarly swift, her voice silenced forever, her name scrubbed from official records. Each woman in the prime of life found her destiny decided not by battlefield valor or political acumen, but by compliance or perceived non-compliance in the most personal of realms. In the stillness of that fateful night, as the thud of the executioner's heart echoed in the Queen's mind, the bedchamber stood as witness to the darkest facets of absolute power. Rule 6 reminds us that favour can be as lethal as any poison, that intimacy can turn to evidence, and that in Henry VIII's reign, losing the king's grace meant yielding to the reaper's scythe. Rule 7. The stench of disease and death. As the waxing years of Henry VIII's reign gave rise to the waning of his strength, the once regal bedchamber transformed into a chamber of horrors under Rule 7. The Queen was compelled to endure the fetid odour of her husband's decaying flesh. Imagine, if you will, the stifling heat of a summer's eve in the palace. The scent of burning tallow mingling with the distant rustle of silk draperies, yet beneath that veneer of luxury lay an odour so vile that it seared itself into memory. Henry, by all accounts, tipped the scales at over £400 in his later years, so prodigiously overweight that servants required a wooden crane and no fewer than 3 attendants to hoist him from the bed each morning. His skin, beset by chronic leg ulcers, peeled away in rotting flakes, which clung tenaciously to the linen. Those flakes, mingled with pus and festering discharge, left permanent stains upon the mattress, stains that endured even after the linen was changed daily. The stench of gangrene permeated the chamber, drifting in languid tendrils that reduced even the most stalwart courtier to retching silence. For Catherine Parr, the 6th Queen, the ordeal was nothing short of torture. She is said to have pressed scented cloths of lavender and rose to her nostrils throughout each intimate encounter, thrusting them deeper as the reek grew stronger. Even so, the fragrance could not mask the overpowering aroma of decay. On more than one occasion, Catherine vomited at the bedside, her trembling hands too weak to steady a chamber pot. Yet under Rule 7, she had no respite. The royal physician, his robes spattered with discoloured poultices, would briskly swab Henry's ulcers with vinegar and a rag, before nodding curtly at the guards, who then ordered the Queen to proceed with her marital duty. This was not mere discomfort. It was a grave medical hazard. Infections from Henry's ulcers were known to spread easily, and the Queen risked succumbing to the very diseases that ravaged her husband. The slightest nick or scratch during their embrace might serve as a conduit for deadly bacteria. To modern eyes, the scenario reeks of negligence and cruelty. Yet in Tudor times, even discussing the possibility of contagion was tantamount to treason. Acknowledging that the king's body might harbour illness was to question his divine right to rule. Thus, the Queen was forced to navigate each encounter with stoic resolve, balancing the terror of infection against the terror of royal disfavour. Throughout the corridor's quiet, the echoes of the Queen's suppressed retchings and stifled cries of disgust were swallowed by stone walls. No servant dared offer her succour, for any suggestion that the king's health was in peril might be construed as sedition. Instead, nurses and chambermaids stood at rigid attention, their faces hidden behind curtained doorways, ready to snatch away the cloths the Queen dropped in her stress. They bore witness to her agony, but possessed no power to halt the nightmarish ritual. Modern medical experts have retroactively diagnosed Henry VIII with gangrene in his leg ulcers and likely type 2 diabetes, conditions that would explain his chronic infections and sudden bouts of lethargy. Yet to broach these diagnoses at court would have invited accusations of lèse-majesté. The court's doctrine held that the king's body was sacred. To admit it was diseased was to commit a sin against the crown itself. Thus, the Queen remained a victim of an unspoken experiment in medieval medicine, her own well-being sacrificed to the illusion of royal invincibility. Each night, as she approached the canopy bed, Catherine Parr steeled herself against both physical and psychological poison. The combination of authority and affliction created a toxic synergy. The king's decrepit body served as a testament to his power, while simultaneously shackling the Queen to an unending cycle of forced intimacy and survival. Her very role as consort became an assessment in human endurance, the capacity to withstand not only emotional subjugation, but the tangible assault of decay upon flesh. In the hush between sighs and moans, the Queen would count the seconds until the ordeal concluded. Each tick of the chamber clock reverberated through her mind like a drumbeat. Should she falter? Should she gag or recoil? Her hesitation would be recorded in the physician's ledger as evidence of defiance, another act of disloyalty. Under Rule 7, there was no refuge in the darkness. Only the grim knowledge that the cost of her silence was her safety, and the cost of her protest might be far worse. By dawn's light, the chamber would be filled with whispers of the night's tribulations. Guards and servants would exchange glances over pale quills, comparing notes on the Queen's composure. She endured well, one might murmur, or perhaps the odour was too much, for she appeared pale at the close. Such comments would circulate among courtiers, shaping the Queen's reputation in the very same breaths she had laboured to suppress her revulsion. And what of Henry, whose decrepit form lay swathed in velvet? To him, the stench was an unfortunate byproduct of his divine station, an odour that attendants were duty-bound to tolerate, just as the Queen was required to endure. His ailments, in his own belief, marked him as chosen by God. Suffering was his rightful burden. The Queen's suffering, therefore, was her shared burden, proof of her loyalty and submission to a mandate higher than her own survival. So let your eyelids grow heavy, and imagine the stench curling from tattered linens, curling around the Queen as she lies awake in the dark. Feel the weight of Rule 7 pressing upon her chest, the twin forces of devotion and dread entwined in every breath. As you drift into slumber, remember that in the Tudor bedchamber, love was poisoned, chastity besmirched, and intimacy weaponized by the odour of disease and the spectre of death. Rule 8. The fear of rumours and coerced testimony. As you sink deeper into the soft embrace of sleep, imagine the last shreds of comfort slipping away, leaving a mind haunted by invisible whispers. Under Rule 8, The Queen's most private moments are never truly private, for gossip and coerced confessions serve as lawful evidence in the Tudor court. Beneath the sheen of velvet tapestries and polished marble floors, an intricate web of spies enforces a regime of suspicion. Every murmured word, every stolen glance, every rumour can become a weapon to convict the Queen. Henry VIII built his network of informants with ruthless efficiency. Ladies-in-waiting, court musicians, and even the lowliest chambermaids were enlisted to report any detail of the Queen's behaviour. No one was exempt. The seamstress who mended her gowns, the cook who prepared her meals, the guard who delivered her nightly summons. All were expected to listen, observe, and relay back to the court any whisper or sight that might tarnish her reputation. Even the maid whose sole task was to clean the royal bedchamber found herself interrogated about every stain on the sheets, every lingering scent of rosewater or musk, and every snippet of conversation overheard within those hallowed walls. In the Tudor imagination, gossip was elevated to a form of evidence, its potency magnified by fear. A casual complaint, "Her Highness seemed reluctant last night," could be transmuted into proof of infidelity. A playful jest, shared among confidantes, "I could not help but laugh as she fumbled with the cord," could be twisted into a sign of immoral familiarity. The court's architects of power understood that rumours spread like wildfire, and by the time they reached the king's ears, they had grown into monstrous allegations. Consider the tragic fate of Anne Boleyn, a queen whose rise and fall hinged on whispers and forced sworn statements. Rumours claimed she had taken multiple lovers, including her own brother, allegations so lurid that they terrified the realm. Yet no direct evidence ever surfaced. It was the confessions extracted under torture, the testimonies racked from terrified witnesses, that formed the bedrock of her conviction. Under duress, servants and pages were made to admit that they had glimpsed clandestine meetings or heard suggestive remarks. These coerced declarations were recorded in ink, sealed with the royal seal, and read aloud in court as incontrovertible proof of treason, adultery, and witchcraft. Catherine Howard, too, suffered the same nightmare. Once a dazzling young bride, she found her past innocent, by any modern standard weaponized against her. Her youthful indiscretions, long before she wore the crown, were dredged up through interrogations that employed both persuasion and torture. Agents of the crown pried into her history, seeking out every dalliance, every flirtation, however benign. And when witnesses faltered, unwilling to lie, they were threatened with imprisonment or worse. The resulting depositions, forced from trembling lips, were used to build a case that led Catherine to the scaffold. In the hush that follows these revelations, the court becomes a prison of the mind. The Queen dares not confide in her dearest friend, for even a sympathetic ear might turn spy. She fears that her own ladies-in-waiting sworn to loyalty could be compelled to testify against her. There is no sanctuary, no confidant whose lips are truly sealed. The very act of speaking, of seeking comfort or counsel, becomes fraught with peril. In this psychological crucible, isolation reigns supreme. The Queen's only companion is the gnawing terror of the court's ever hunger for secrets. Modern legal scholars identify this pattern as a textbook case of abuse of power. By converting rumours into legally admissible evidence, the Tudor regime created a mechanism of repression through which truth mattered far less than perception. A single rumour, once spun into the legal record, could override any defence. The court's inquisitors wielded gossip like a rapier, its sharp point aimed at the Queen's very heart. In this environment, innocence was no shield. The Queen was guilty until every whisper could be disproven, and disproving an unspoken accusation was often an impossible task. The system of gossip, coerced confession, execution turned the palace into a prison not just of walls, but of thoughts. Every smile, every frown, every hint of laughter was scrutinized as potential evidence of disloyalty. The Queen learned to move through her days as though treading on a field of hidden traps, where any misstep could trigger another round of interrogation. Sleep offered no refuge, for the court's echoes followed her into dreams, whispering of spies behind tapestries, of secret slips of paper handed to guards, of midnight meetings distorted into treasonous conspiracies. By candlelight or moonlight, the Queen rehearsed her words with silent dread. She mapped out every phrase, every tone, ensuring that nothing ambiguous might be twisted into a scandalous inference. Her personal letters were never left unattended. The royal archivist's staff combed through every syllable for subversive meaning. Even her prayers, spoken in the stillness of the chapel, risked misinterpretation by those eager to discover hidden slander against the king. Yet for all the fear, the Queen was compelled to persist. To speak was to invite suspicion. To remain silent was to appear aloof and ungrateful for the king's favour. She existed in a constant state of tension, her body like a taut bowstring ready to snap. Each day, she navigated this labyrinth of dread, performing not only the duties of a consort but also the role of a defendant, perpetually anticipating the moment when the court's blade of gossip would fall. And so we have sequentially explored 8 horrifying rules in Henry VIII's bedchamber, from the relentless wedding night inspections to the terror of constant surveillance and slander. Now, those tragedies are no longer mere legend, but have crystallized into profound consequences for the 6 women who once bore the title of Tudor Queen. Each endured 2 common wounds: the profound theft of her privacy and the lingering trauma to her psyche. Beyond these shared afflictions, each individual suffered unique torments, physical and reputational, shaped by her particular circumstances and character. Next, we will delve into 6 sections of consequence analysis, each approximately 400 words long, to see more clearly how every queen was broken both in body and in spirit under the ruthless authority of Henry VIII. Consequences of the bedchamber rules on Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, the first of Henry VIII's 6 wives, faced the insidious aftermath of those 8 dreadful rules in her most private sanctuary. From the outset of her marriage, she was subjected to the horror of wedding night inspections, and the echoes of that trauma haunted her long after the sheets were changed. Common consequence 1: anxiety disorder and obsession with wedding night records. Even years after the ceremonial inspection of her first night with Henry, Catherine could not shake the relentless dread that her most intimate moments had been catalogued and dissected. Modern psychologists might diagnose her with a severe anxiety disorder, one born of repeated exposure to a ritual that treated consummation like a trial. Every creak of a floorboard or rustle of silk drapes rekindled the fear that hidden court clerks were rifling through their ledgers, searching for a single discrepancy, any hint that her performance had fallen short of Tudor expectations. In her journals, she describes nights spent trembling under her canopy, convinced that she could still hear the physician's quill scratching across parchment as he logged her body's evidence. This obsessive fear of those records, what they contained, who had read them, how they might be used against her, persisted as a ghostly presence in her mind. Common consequence 2: loss of marital security and erosion of privacy. Where marriage should have offered sanctuary, Catherine found only vulnerability. The bed that might have symbolized love and trust instead served as a stage for relentless scrutiny. Once the wedding night must be proven rule had taken hold, there was no turning back. Every subsequent union became a reenactment of that first trial, each one stripping away another layer of her privacy. Catherine longed for the simple assurance of confidentiality, the knowledge that her relationship with the king could remain unobserved. Yet under Henry's absolute authority, she never felt safe. Her body was never her own. The absence of private space corroded her faith in the sanctity of marriage itself. In letters to her confidants, she lamented that a queen's bedchamber offered no refuge, only a cold testament to state power. Individual consequence 1: trauma from multiple miscarriages and the pressure to bear a son. Catherine's ordeal did not end with the wedding night investigations. Over the course of her marriage, she endured 6 or 7 miscarriages, each loss inflicting new wounds on her body and spirit. In Tudor belief, a queen's foremost duty was to produce a male heir. Every failed pregnancy was interpreted as proof of her inadequacy. Catherine's miscarriages became public misfortunes, seized upon as evidence that she had somehow failed the king. The repeated cycles of hope, anguish, and social censure left her emotionally shattered. She spoke of crushing guilt at each loss, fearing that another failed womb would mean her downfall. The pressure to bear a son, combined with the constant medical examinations, poultices, and folk remedies, turned her womb into a battlefield and her heart into a well of despair. Individual consequence 2: inner conflict between religious duty and royal obligation. Catherine was, above all else, a devout Catholic, and her faith shaped her sense of identity and moral duty. Yet the Tudor court imposed demands that sometimes stood in tension with her religious convictions. Her belief in the sanctity of marriage and the divine order of life clashed with Henry's ruthless insistence on annulment when she failed to produce a male heir. Catherine's refusal to abandon her first marriage for political convenience to accept the king's claim that her union was invalid stemmed from her religious conviction that her marriage to Henry was indissoluble. This inner conflict ate at her. Loyalty to the church meant defying the king, while loyalty to the king demanded the betrayal of her faith. In her personal writings, she expresses the agony of being torn between obedience to her conscience and submission to royal decree. In the silence of her chambers, Catherine felt the weight of these four consequences, two shared by all of Henry's wives, and two uniquely her own. Anxiety stalked her dreams. Privacy became an illusion, her body a site of trauma, and her soul a battleground between faith and crown. Yet even as she endured these trials, she maintained a dignity and resilience that would become the substrate of her lasting legacy. A queen who, despite every measure of state power arrayed against her, refused to surrender her faith or her sense of self. Consequences of the bedchamber rules on Queen Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, ascended the throne amid whispers of passion and reform. Yet beneath the elegance of courtly life lay the 8 merciless rules of the Tudor bedchamber, which wrought irreversible harm upon her mind, body, and reputation. Common consequence 1. Post-traumatic stress disorder from surveillance, slander, and coerced testimony. Anne's intellect and wit once dazzled the court, but the constant watch of invisible eyes transformed her daily life into a waking nightmare. Under the doctrine that no private word was safe, Anne was followed by spies, ladies-in-waiting, chambermaids, guards each primed to report the slightest hint of disloyalty or personal weakness. Their notes, scrawled in secret margin ledgers, detailed her laughter, her pauses, even her changing expressions during private audiences. When rumors of her alleged affairs spread, these same agents coerced testimonies from terrified witnesses, employing torture or threats to force confessions. Each forced statement, each whispered deposition, became another source of torment. Modern psychologists would recognize Anne's trembling hands, sleepless nights, and recurring nightmares as classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, an unrelenting replay of betrayal and intimidation that no dawn could dispel. Common consequence 2. Erosion of self-esteem and hypervigilance in personal relationships. Once a lady-in-waiting with a bright future, Anne found herself losing faith in every human bond. The bedchamber had taught her that intimacy meant vulnerability. Any moment of trust could be used as evidence of treason. She grew hyper-vigilant, questioning even the most well-meaning words of friends. Was the Queen's confidant praising her beauty, or setting her up for slander? Was a gentle touch on the arm a sign of solidarity, or a ruse recorded to indict her later? This perpetual mistrust eroded Anne's self-esteem. She scrawled in her private prayers about the loneliness that clung to her like a second skin, lamenting that even her closest companions might become informants overnight. The paranoia seeped into every conversation, poisoning the simple warmth of human connection. Individual consequence 1. Damage to honor through accusations of adultery and treason. No accusation was more devastating than the charge of adultery, a crime against the crown and the king's person. Anne's reputation, once vibrant with promise, was shattered when she was accused of liaisons with multiple nobles, including her own brother. These allegations lacked credible evidence, but thrived on the fertile soil of rumor and forced confessions. The court's legal edifice treated gossip as fact, and Anne's honor crumbled in the public eye. Scholars of Tudor law note that adultery by a queen was equated with high treason. Thus, the slander that she had betrayed Henry was tantamount to a death sentence. The scandal spread across Europe, staining her memory and undermining any claim to respect or dignity she might have retained. Individual consequence 2. Pressure to perform, intimacy to maintain favor, only to be betrayed. Anne's early days as queen were marked by her acute awareness that her physical and emotional performances were under continuous review. To keep Henry's affection and thereby secure her position, she felt compelled to exhibit enthusiasm and compliance in private audiences. Every sigh of pleasure, every blush, had to be convincing, lest suspicion arise. Yet even her carefully curated performance proved insufficient to secure lasting favour. As Henry's passions shifted, the very zeal that once proved her devotion was cited as evidence of her experienced nature, fueling the narrative that she had carnal knowledge of others. Thus, the intimate prowess she deployed as a means of survival was turned against her in the final indictment, a bitter betrayal that saw her executed, not for any proven crime, but for the perceived threat her independence posed to the crown. In the cold dawn air of that fateful morning, Anne Boleyn's executioner's block awaited her outside the Tower of London. Her final walk echoed with the ghosts of every whispered claim, every coerced confession, and every clandestine note taken in the darkness of the bedchamber. She met her end with dignity, yet the legacy of those 8 nightmarish rules left an indelible mark on her body and soul. A queen undone by surveillance, slander, and the cruel inversion of intimacy into a tool of political vengeance. As you let your eyes grow heavy and your breath slow, ponder Anne's fate and steel yourself for the next journey to Queen Jane Seymour and her own trials under Henry's unrelenting demands. Consequences of the bedchamber rules on Queen Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, entered the royal bedchamber with hopes of stability and peace after the turbulent reigns of her predecessors. Yet the same 8 merciless rules governed her life, yielding both universal wounds shared by all Tudor consorts and unique afflictions born of her own fateful story. Common consequence 1. Living in perpetual fear of losing favour. From the moment Jane ascended to queenship, she learned that Henry's affections could shift as swiftly as candlelight. The slightest misstep, an untimely cough, a hesitant glance, or perceived indifference had the power to plunge her into royal disfavour. This fear was not abstract but visceral, lodged like a stone in her chest as she awaited his summons each evening. Modern historians believe Jane's devotion to Henry was matched only by her anxiety, for at court, the ascent to favour could be followed by a precipitous fall. She dared not allow herself comfort or complacency. Every appearance required careful calibration of speech, expression, and attire. The crown weighed heavily on her brow, a constant reminder that love in the Tudor bedchamber was a precarious treasure, easily lost. Common consequence. 2. A sense of isolation and reluctance to confide. Despite her reputed kindness and gentle nature, Jane found herself isolated behind palace walls. The bedchamber rules forbade any genuine intimacy, even with her closest ladies-in-waiting. She could not unburden her anxieties for fear that confidantes might become informants, her private words twisted into evidence of treason or impropriety. This isolation deepened her loneliness, as she carried the weight of expectation without solace. Letters to friends outside court were monitored. Whispered prayers in the chapel could be reported as seditious mutterings. Thus, Jane bore her fears alone, her heart heavy with unspoken dread. Individual consequence 1. Ordeals of childbirth and fatal complications. Jane's greatest hope and her gravest trial came with the birth of a male heir. Her successful delivery of Prince Edward in October 1536 marked a triumph for both her and the Tudor dynasty. Yet the joy of motherhood was cruelly intertwined with suffering. Childbirth in Tudor England was perilous, and Jane's labour resulted in serious complications: fever, excessive bleeding, and a weakened constitution. Medieval physicians applied leeching, strong purgatives, and herbal potions, none of which could stem the infection that followed. Within days, Jane succumbed to postnatal complications, her body ravaged by what modern medicine would recognise as puerperal sepsis. Her death at the age of 29 transformed her from cherished consort into martyr, but at the cost of her life. Individual consequence 2. The idealised self-sacrificing queen as propaganda. In the aftermath of Jane's death, her image was appropriated by the Tudor regime as the epitome of queenly virtue, loyal, fertile, and selfless unto death. Contemporary artists and court poets cast her as the self-sacrificing queen, a paragon whose willingness to die for her son cemented her legacy. While this idealization honored her memory, it also eclipsed her agency and humanity. Jane's sacrifice became a political tool, used to bolster Henry's reputation and to encourage future queens to emulate her quiet obedience. Thus, her true struggles, her incessant fear of losing favour, her painful isolation, her fatal childbirth were subsumed under a glossy veneer of propagandistic heroism. In her brief reign, Jane Seymour experienced both the universal cruelties of the Tudor bedchamber and her own specific tragedies. She lived in constant dread of Henry's changing affections and bore the burden of secrecy in a world where no confidence was safe. Her ultimate demise from childbirth complications underscored the lethal stakes of a queen's reproductive duty, and her posthumous idealization deprived her of the full complexity of her story. As you feel sleep drawing near, remember Jane's gentle strength in the face of unrelenting demands, and prepare for the next chapter, in which Anne of Cleves confronts the consequences of those same 8 dreadful rules. Consequences of the bedchamber rules on Queen Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves, the 4th wife of Henry VIII, entered the Tudor bedchamber, anticipating a strategic alliance, only to become a tragic demonstration of the regime's cruel sexual politics. The 8 horrifying rules that governed every other queen applied equally to her, inflicting both shared and unique wounds. Common consequence 1. Trauma from being victimized by sexual performance reviews and loss of the right to refuse. From the moment Anne crossed the threshold of her bridal chamber, she was thrust into a state of severe psychological trauma. The Tudor doctrine that the wedding night must be proven insisted that her body perform on demand, with no regard for her comfort or consent. The royal physician and his attendants stood ready at dawn to inspect the sheets for evidence of consummation, and courtiers lingered to measure the length and quality of her union with Henry. Each tick of the clock reminded Anne that her private life was public spectacle, a performance review of her sexuality. Modern psychologists recognize such invasive monitoring as a form of sexual coercion that can induce lasting post-traumatic stress disorder. Anne later confided in her letters that she felt stripped of autonomy, forced into acts that felt less like marriage and more like state-sanctioned violation. Common consequence 2. Loss of trust in political marriage and personal self-worth. Anne had agreed to the marriage as a political necessity, but the humiliation she endured shattered her faith in the institution itself. A union meant to secure peace between England and her homeland in Cleves instead became a harrowing ordeal. The realization that her value to Henry was measured only by his fleeting physical satisfaction and that failing to entertain his desires could cost her everything eroded her sense of self-worth. In private moments, she confessed fear that no marriage could ever provide love or security, only the threat of abandonment or disgrace. Her political acumen and gentle disposition, which once defined her, were overshadowed by her dread of another bedchamber tribunal. Isame. Individual consequence 1. Public humiliation as unclean and forced annulment. Perhaps no blow was more crushing than Henry's infamous declaration that Anne was unclean and repulsive, a statement made not in private but in councils and courtly gatherings. This public denunciation branded her as a woman whose very body offended the king, a stigma that travelled swiftly through London's streets and into the highest courtiers' gossip. The annulment that followed was framed not as a mutual agreement, but as the removal of an unfit consort. Anne's name was recorded in royal decrees, alongside words like disgust and impurity, leaving her reputation in tatters. This public shaming transformed what should have been a graceful separation into an enduring scar on her honour. Individual consequence. 2. Retreat into seclusion, devotion to charity, and reliance on friendship over royal favour. After the annulment, Anne faced a choice: remain in the glare of courtly intrusion or retreat into privacy. She chose the latter, refusing the typical exile or harsh treatment meted out to disgraced consorts. Granted a generous settlement and the title, the King's beloved sister, she moved to Richmond Palace, where she devoted herself to charitable works, founding hospitals, supporting widows, and helping the poor of the city. This self-imposed isolation allowed her to rebuild a sense of purpose outside the brutal scrutiny of the Tudor court. Rather than seeking new alliances through marriage, Anne cultivated a circle of genuine friends, foreign ambassadors, clergy, and ladies of her own choosing, who valued her for her kindness and intelligence rather than her political utility. In this way, she reclaimed some dignity, demonstrating that a queen's worth could transcend the caprices of a capricious monarch. Anne of Cleves's tenure as queen consort was brief, but the psychological and social repercussions of the 8 bedchamber rules endured long after Henry's declaration of annulment. She bore the collective trauma shared by all Tudor queens, the terror of sexual coercion and violation of privacy, while weathering her own unique ordeal of public humiliation and exile. Yet her response to these wounds revealed her remarkable resilience. Retreating into seclusion and charitable service, she forged a new identity that defied the limitations imposed by royal decree. As you drift towards slumber, imagine Anne's quiet determination in her Richmond garden, turning her back on the court's venom to nurture life and hope among the less fortunate. In that peaceful solitude, she found a measure of freedom that even the king's most severe rules could not take away. Soon, we will turn to Catherine Howard, whose own tragic story under Henry's reign illuminates the final depths of these bedchamber horrors. Consequences of the bedchamber rules on Queen Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, entered the Tudor court as a bright young bride, only to find herself ensnared in the final, merciless web of those 8 nightmarish bedchamber rules. Despite her youth and initial favour, Catherine soon discovered that gossip and coerced testimony could destroy even the most innocent heart, and that every word she uttered risked being used as evidence against her. Common consequence 1. Haunted by the cycle of rumour, coerced confession, execution. From the moment she donned the Queen's crown, Catherine lived under the shadow of Rule 8, which treated every whisper as law. Court whispers of her past flirtations, though entirely proper in her girlhood, were magnified into accusations of illicit relationships. Spies hidden among her ladies-in-waiting reported casual giggles, stolen glances, and innocent banter to the king's ministers. These rumours were passed to interrogators who employed threats and confined witnesses in tower cells to extract forced confessions. Catherine's own confidants were compelled under duress to recount private conversations, each sinuous confession inked into legal documents. The result was a spiralling trauma, as Catherine realized that whispers could become warrants for her guilt. Every cough in the hallway, every stifled giggle, haunted her with the dread that another rumor might ignite the machinery of her undoing. She developed a trembling vigilance, forever bracing herself for the next wave of slander that might sweep her into the fatal current of Tudor justice. Common consequence 2. Total loss of freedom of speech and a life lived in fear of accusation. In that gilded cage of surreptitious eyes and ears, Catherine learned that silence was her only defense. To speak openly was to risk another fragment of gossip, another entry in the king's dossier of allegations. Even prayers whispered beneath the chapel's vaulted ceiling could be construed as seditious mutterings. The Queen's letters were intercepted and read by clerks, eager to discover any hint of disloyalty. At every court gathering, Catherine sat with her posture rigid, her words measured, terrified that a playful remark might be retold as treachery. This suffocating environment extinguished her natural vivacity. She became a portrait of muted grace. Her bright spirit dimmed by the constant terror of being reported. The Queen, who once laughed easily as a child, was reduced to a portrait of stoicism, every expression carefully rehearsed to avoid another insidious accusation. Individual consequence 1. Deep personal wounds, as her past affections were exploited. Catherine's youthful romances, engaged in before her entry into royal life and entirely lawful at the time, were resurrected as damning proof of moral turpitude. Agents of the crown dug through her memory, questioning former suitors and servants alike, forcing them under threat to testify that she had shared stolen kisses and whispered vows of love. These testimonies, extracted under pain or promise of mercy, were recorded and used to brand Catherine as unchaste. The Queen, only in her late teens, saw her honest affections distorted into sordid claims. The anguish cut deep. Her reputation, once innocent and unblemished, was torn apart, and she was left to weep at the realization that her own emotions had become the ammunition for her downfall. Catherine's heart, which had known only the simple joys of youthful companionship, was shattered by the knowledge that her private past was now public condemnation. Individual consequence. 2. Utter despair, as she faced execution, isolation and shame. When the weight of rumour and confession finally tipped against her, Catherine found herself condemned to the executioner's block. Unlike earlier queens, she had no children whose births might temper her sentence. Her fate was sealed in a clandestine trial, presided over by judges eager to satisfy the king's fury. As she awaited her end in the secluded galleries of the Tower, Catherine experienced a despair unlike any other Tudor consort. No allies could reach her, no confidant could offer solace, and no appeals could halt the king's decree. In her final hours, she wrote letters laced with remorse and pleas for forgiveness, though she knew they would never be delivered. Her once bright hopes withered in the cold isolation of her cell. On the morning of her execution, the young queen walked to the scaffold alone, her chin held high but her eyes hollow with shame. The cheers of the crowd and the clatter of the executioner's block echoed in her ears as she faced death not as a monarch seeking mercy, but as a victim of a system that had twisted intimacy and rumour into instruments of fatal revenge. In her brief and tragic tenure, Catherine Howard became both martyr and cautionary tale, a living example of how the 8 bedchamber rules could transform a hopeful bride into a broken woman, stripped of voice, trust, and ultimately life. As you close your eyes, imagine the silent halls of the Tower, where her final prayers were swallowed by stone, and prepare to meet the last queen, Catherine Parr, in our concluding exploration of these Tudor horrors. Consequences of the bedchamber rules on Queen Catherine Parr. As the last of Henry VIII's 6 wives, Catherine Parr entered the Tudor bedchamber with both wariness and resolve. She had witnessed the fates of her predecessors and understood that the 8 dreadful rules of the royal bedroom spared no one. Yet even her keen intellect and affectionate nature could not shield her from the lasting wounds those rules inflicted. Common consequence 1. Chronic anxiety and hypervigilance in all marital interactions. Catherine Parr lived in a state of perpetual tension, her mind forever poised for the next summons or the faintest whisper of disfavour. The bedchamber rituals, routine inspections, forced consummations, and performance reviews etched deep grooves of worry into her psyche. Each time she heard the hollow echo of her name through the palace corridors, her heart leapt as though summoned to an inquisition. Modern psychologists would recognize these symptoms as chronic anxiety disorder, marked by sleepless nights and a constant sense of impending doom. Even in moments of genuine affection with the king, Catherine found herself second-guessing every gesture, every word, fearing that a single misstep might be recorded by hidden court scribes or misinterpreted by spies. This hypervigilance extended beyond her marriage. She approached all relationships with caution, never fully relaxing her guard, as though every smile might conceal a trap. Common consequence. 2. Ambiguity between the roles of royal maid and obsolete queen. Catherine's position in the Tudor hierarchy was fraught with contradiction. Upon Henry's death, she transitioned from queen consort to dowager queen, a shift that blurred her identity. Was she still the locus of royal power, or merely a servant to the crown's memory? The bedchamber rules had stripped her of autonomy, even as she wore a crown. Now, in widowhood, she retained the title but lost its authority. Courtiers whispered that she was neither fully queen nor commoner a royal maid in status, but a displaced figure whose usefulness had expired. This ambiguity weighed heavily on Catherine. She struggled to find her place within the court and in her own mind. The rituals that once dictated her conduct as queen, ritual visits, religious reforms, intellectual patronage, now felt like burdens without purpose. Her identity wavered between the grandeur of her former role and the uncertainty of her present station. Individual consequence 1. Mental turmoil. Following widowhood and remarriage. When Henry VIII passed away in January 1547, Catherine faced both relief and sorrow. She had survived his unpredictable reign, but she also mourned the man to whom she had sworn loyalty. As dowager queen, she inherited the mantle of guardian to his young children, yet she bore the scars of his bedchamber's cruelties. Within months, she chose to marry Thomas Seymour, the king's uncle, a decision that surprised many. The marriage offered companionship but also renewed anxieties. Could she trust a new husband after the torture of Henry's rules? Her journals reveal a mind torn between hope for a happier partnership and dread of repeating the past. She found herself tiptoeing around Thomas's moods, acutely aware that her own desires might once again be subordinated to a man's authority. This union, intended to bring solace, instead unleashed new waves of mental turmoil as Catherine navigated the complex demands of widowhood, loyalty to her late king, and the exhilaration and fear of a fresh alliance. Individual consequence too, enduring impact on religious thought and patronage of learning. Despite, or perhaps because of the trauma she endured, Catherine Parr emerged as a fervent advocate for religious reform and intellectual inquiry. The bedchamber's invasive scrutiny had shown her the dangers of ignorance and superstition, prompting her to seek solace in Protestant writings and humanist scholarship. She became the first English queen to publish under her own name, producing works that guided women in godly living and promoted the education of children. Her personal suffering lent urgency to her belief that spiritual and intellectual freedom were paramount. After her remarriage, she continued to host learned discussions at her residences, drawing reformers and scholars into her circle. Yet this very zeal drew suspicion from conservative factions, who viewed her patronage as a threat to traditional authority. Catherine's advocacy, born from the crucible of bedchamber horrors, thus carried a double-edged consequence. It enriched England's intellectual life, while exposing her to renewed censure and the risk of religious persecution. In her final year, Catherine Parr walked the delicate line between innovation and orthodoxy, her heart and mind bearing the indelible marks of Henry's reign. She never fully escaped the legacy of those 8 dreadful rules, the chronic anxiety that shadowed her days, the blurred reality of her station, the mental upheaval of widowhood and remarriage, and the fervent yet precarious embrace of religious and intellectual freedom. In her short life after the king's death, she demonstrated that resilience and learning could flourish, even amid the most invasive tyranny, but at a personal cost that echoed in every quiet moment. As your eyelids grow heavy, imagine Catherine Parr in her study by candlelight, poring over sacred texts, her hand trembling not from fear of inspection, but from the lingering echoes of bedchamber trauma. And let your mind drift, for soon we shall close this Tudor chapter and reflect upon the enduring lessons of those 8 nightmarish rules. And so, dear friend, as our journey through the shadowed corridors of Tudor history winds gently to a close, let us lower our voices and soften our thoughts, allowing the echoes of those 8 dreadful bedchamber rules to drift away like candle smoke in a silent hall. Though we have walked through whispered accusations and felt the chill of hidden eyes upon every tender moment, let us remember that these stories, so steeped in sorrow and mistrust, carry with them a lesson of profound value, that true intimacy and trust must be built on mutual respect, privacy and understanding, rather than on fear, coercion, or rumor. In the dim glow of our shared reflection, we honor the resilience of 6 remarkable women: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, each of whom bore the weight of power's cruelest demands and yet, through courage or quiet endurance, emerged as enduring symbols of dignity in the face of tyranny. Their lives remind us that human dignity cannot be extinguished even by the harshest of laws, and that every person deserves the sanctuary of their own heart, free from surveillance or slander. As you settle into the comfort of your bed, feel the warmth of compassion surrounding you, and know that the bonds we create with those we love are meant to be safe havens, places where our voices are heard, our choices respected, and our hearts cherished. Let the lessons of Tudor secrecy fade now into the soft embrace of understanding and empathy, allowing each breath to grow slower, each muscle to relax, and each thought to subside into a gentle hush. Imagine a soft mist rolling over a quiet meadow at dusk, the last rays of sunlight dipping below the horizon, and the world drifting into a peaceful rest. Hold on to the comforting truth that, unlike those haunted queens,